The following is a conversation between Bradford K. Smith, President and CEO of the Foundation Center, and Denver Frederick, host of The Business of Giving on AM 970 The Answer in New York City.
The role of change is increasing in every field of endeavor, including philanthropy. And in order to be a true leader in the field, a person can't be 100% consumed with just the well-being and state of the organization they lead. They also must leave some space and time to contemplate what all these changes mean for the entire sector. One individual that fits that description perfectly is my next guest. He is Bradford K. Smith, the President and CEO of the Foundation Center. Good evening, Brad, and welcome back to The Business of Giving.
It's great to be back here.
For those listeners that are not familiar with the Foundation Center, tell us about the work that you do.
Great. I think the easiest way to understand us is sort of what Bloomberg does for the financial markets, we do for philanthropy. Basically, we publish data and information about the transaction of philanthropy. In other words, these endowed foundations that make grants to support organizations in the social sector to make the world a better place. We track all that information. We put it out there in an unbiased way that you can search it, you can find it. You can understand who's funding your cause, who's not funding your cause, what foundations are doing and what they're not doing.
Let's talk about foundations for a moment. When we look at philanthropy in the U.S., last year about $375 billion was made in contributions. What percentage of that comes from foundations?
Yeah, it's roughly 16 to 17%, and this is sort of, I think a common misunderstanding. A lot of people look at nonprofits in America and they assume that their largest supporters are wealthy foundations and maybe individuals, but the largest source of income for American nonprofits in the aggregate is actually government. Foundation money is very important because it's one of the few sources of income that nonprofits have that usually isn't earmarked. It's very flexible.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that. I think foundations are pretty abstract to most people. It's kind of just a big idea out there. And I think you have a wonderful way of explaining it by talking about the sources of influence that they hold. And there are three of them. And let's pick up on each. And I'm going to pick on the one you just mentioned. The one that's obvious to everybody is money. But as you say, it's a very special kind of money, right?
Correct. Foundations have a really important role in American history and American society. Basically, our government has created a kind of social pact in which wealthy individuals are given a tax incentive for creating a charitable foundation. They make a donation of a portion of their assets to the foundation. They no longer control those assets. They can't take them back for personal use. They get a tax exemption in exchange for creating a stream of charitable giving in the future. Now, there's a lot of ways to look at the size of the philanthropic sector in the U.S. There's a lot of foundations. I know when the Foundation Center was created in 1956, there weren't near as many. In fact, when the Foundation Center published the first print directory of American foundations, there were about 4,000 foundations. Today, there's well over 80,000 foundations, about 87, 88,000. And their assets they manage, their investments, surpass $800 billion. And it's the earnings on those investments, which are tax-free, that are used to actually fund grants and fulfill their charitable purpose.
Right. The second source of influence that foundations have is convening power.
Correct.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, money obviously, it's really funny. When I worked for foundations for many years, there's not a whole lot of people in this world whose job is to give away money. And people always were sort of perplexed about that. They said, how do you find the organizations to be, worthy of getting the support of the foundation? And I used to tell them, I said, look, when you're in the business of giving away money, you don't have to go looking for people, they find you. So, one of the things that gives foundations a seat at virtually any table is the fact that they're giving away money.
Yeah.
And the other thing is they're giving away money which, unlike congressional money or city money, isn't earmarked by elected officials for their pet causes. It's very flexible, long-term, risk-taking money. But this also gives them the ability to convene. And we find that the foundations that are having the greatest impact on the issues they're working, whether it be criminal justice or climate change or job creation are not just giving away grants in a retail kind of way. They're actually creating tables at which policymakers, academics, activists, and others can come and really sort of think about what the long-term solutions are to these really serious problems that our society and our world faces.
Yeah, and it would seem in an era of collaboration, they do have that special role to be able to do that. They don't have a dog in the fight. They're neutral.
Correct.
They give money away, and they have an incredible ability that just about everybody comes when they call the meeting.
Yeah, they used to, when I worked at the Ford Foundation, the two jokes, they always tell you when you start to work there, basically is that, all your phone calls get returned, and immediately it seems like all of your ideas are brilliant.
That's right. And you also become a little funnier and better looking too, right?
That's right, yes, of course. One of the perks, two of the perks.
And finally, and this is so important, is the accumulated knowledge that foundations hold. Speak to that.
Yeah, and I think this is really sort of the frontier for foundations. I think roughly, we can say that, and I know you've had a lot of speakers come on this program, that by and large, foundations have moved from the notion of just giving away money, kind of a charity approach, to what a lot of people call social investment. The idea that even though you're making a grant, you're investing in a solution and you're expecting return in the form of impact. But another way to look at foundations is, and I gave a presentation on this recently, and I said when it comes to knowledge and information, foundations are like black holes, and they need to become supernovas. So what do I mean by that? The average foundation receives hundreds, if not thousands, of proposals from nonprofit organizations, different kinds of social sector organizations, filled with ideas about how to make the neighborhood, the community, the city, and the world a better place. Some portion of those get approved, and as part of the process, the groups that get the grants provide written reports periodically, progress reports, full of information also. Then there's also the foundation staff themselves. If you're sitting in a foundation, let's say you're working on early childhood issues, on any given day, you probably talk to 4 or 5 different people who are the best in their field, who have fantastic ideas about how to solve all the issues around early childhood learning. And you accumulate all that knowledge. That knowledge is in your head, it's in your notes, it's on your hard drive. All this documentation is flowing into foundations. If we weren't philanthropy, we were Google or we were Facebook, we would have data scientists crawling all over that stuff.
Tagging everything,
looking for correlations, trying to extract. Now, this is a tremendous source of potential knowledge about how we can make this world a far better place. And I think the next frontier for philanthropy is going to be managing information and producing and sharing knowledge.
Let's talk a little bit about that frontier. A few years ago, the Foundation Center started a blog called Glass Pockets. The tagline was, bringing transparency to the world of philanthropy. And when it comes to the world of foundation transparency, there is a development which you believe will have a profound effect. It's machine-readable 990s. Tell us, what is that, and what is the significance of it?
Yeah, and I think that phrase, machine-readable 990s, if we went out onto Broadway out here, and we asked a bunch of people what they think about machine-readable 990s, we get a lot of blank stares, right? Okay. First of all, just the whole notion of transparency is in the DNA of the Foundation Center because we were created during McCarthyism when foundations were being investigated for support of un-American activities. And a group of foundation leaders felt that the best way to deal with that kind of suspicion was to create a public information service about philanthropy. And part of that is we're not an advocacy organization, we're not membership, we're neutral. But there is one thing we advocate on, and that is transparency, because that's why we were created. And in fact, the name of the site we have on this, glasspockets.org, comes from a quote that was used at the founding of the Foundation Center that we believe we think the foundation should have glass pockets, that came from the chair of the Carnegie Foundation board at the time. So we've been promoting foundation transparency, and for years, the tax return that foundations file, which is called a 990 PF, which means private foundation. This is what the endowed foundations file. Because of the tax exemption they have in exchange for serving the public good, is open information. What that means, or what it's meant until very recently, is that that document, if you request it, should be available from the foundation itself and available from the Internal Revenue Service.
Okay.
Now, what a lot of people don't understand is those documents are filed, some portion of them are filed electronically online by foundations. Many of them are filed in written form.
The old-fashioned way.
And some of them, because we see these all the time, some are still filled out in pencil. But up until very recently, regardless of how they were filled out, the Internal Revenue Service was fulfilling its public information requirement by making them available as image files. Something called a TIFF file, which probably the easiest way for people to understand it is just like a PDF.
Yeah.
So even if you filed,
Static, right?
Yeah, even if you filed it digitally, anybody who requests it essentially gets a picture of it. Now, if you've ever tried to edit a PDF or do anything with a PDF, you can't do anything with it, right? It's not like a Word document. It's not digital. It's a picture. It's like a photograph. So we and GuideStar and other organizations that work a lot with these tax returns in order to get information from them basically had to create a pretty significant infrastructure to try to extract data from these documents, which is largely a manual process.
Yeah.
As of just a few months ago, the Internal Revenue Service surprised everyone by releasing all the tax returns, the 990-PFs, that have been digitally filed as machine-readable open data. So what is machine-readable open data?
What does that mean?
Yeah. What it means is it's actually released in a form where it can be automatically harvested by a computer with no human intervention. Basically, if you think of the computer as like a vacuum cleaner, it sort of sucks in all that information, and then using algorithms and other kinds of computer programs, you can manipulate and begin to do all sorts of things with that information. So all of a sudden, the barriers to actually creating something useful out of information have been drastically lowered and made much cheaper.
Now, this only works for those 990-PFs that have been digitally filed.
Correct.
Is the IRS thinking of making that mandatory down the road?
As I understand it, this being America, this would require an act of Congress.
Okay.
Now, another shocking fact about foundations, which I find people, they're always aghast at. I ask them, what percentage of foundations do you think have websites? And it turns out that the answer is roughly 7%. And even the very largest foundations that have over $100 million in assets, there's about 1,000 of those. 30% of them do not have websites.
That's pretty shocking.
A country like the Netherlands, by law, if you have a foundation, you have to have a website. So there's no mandatory filing requirement for these tax returns. We downloaded all the ones that the IRS has released, and for, I think, 2014, roughly there were some around 50,000 foundation tax returns were included. So, more than maybe 60% of the foundations were included, and these were because those documents were filed online and released in digital form. So what does this really mean? What it means is that basically the proverbial two kids in a garage with good programming skills, people that can create algorithms and maybe have big hard drives or cloud storage, can grab all this information and start doing things with it. Like what? They could search for part of that document, for example, is you have to list the titles, the names, titles, and salaries of the 5 highest paid employees. Right. So you could basically, take the CEO salaries. And if you don't know the field, and you basically just want to make a comparison, you could say, well, the president of the Gates Foundation makes X, and the president of the Bob and Betty Sue Foundation in Mississippi makes 1/10 of that.
Yes.
There ought to be a law. You could do the same with all the overhead expenses, travel, all this kind of stuff. The grants by law, part of that document is you're supposed to list all the grants you made and the recipient and the amount. You're supposed to have a description. Now, a lot of people don't put the description. The good side is that this could begin to force people to improve the information. The bad side is that people could extract a lot of information they don't understand.
That's right.
And then I think the other thing that is going to really, surprise foundations is foundations are required to attach to that tax return a list of all their investment holdings at the time they file. And it will be much easier for anyone to search through the investment portfolios of foundations to see what stocks and bonds they're holding. And, again, if someone wants to make mischief, they could point out that, well, if your mission is basically to improve healthcare and you are heavily invested in tobacco companies, that may be inconsistent. And some foundations in the past, when they've been pressured by inconvenient press stories, this is one of the points of entry that the journalists have done. But it's been very hard to get that information.
Well, it's all very interesting. I think it's going to change the nature of your work. You've been sort of toiling to extract this information and make some sense, but it would seem that you're going to have a higher level of analysis now, that machines are doing it probably faster and probably more comprehensively than people ever could.
Well, we deal very heavily with the grants information because one of the main consumers of our information are nonprofits that are trying to figure out which foundations might be willing to give them a grant. So we produce large searchable databases that you can search by cause, environment, health, arts, or whatever, and then narrow it down to exactly the foundations that may fund in your geographic area, your particular kind of work, and then see actual examples of grants. So we work a lot with the grants. Historically, we've only basically extracted and coded and sorted and put into these databases about 250 to 300,000 grants a year because we were actually manually extracting those and then hand coding them. We had people looking at them and saying, okay, this must be arts, and for arts it must be sculpture, and it's for the state of such and such, and it's to such and such organization. We saw this coming, and actually in 2012, we started rebuilding our core databases to be able to ingest information that was coming in directly from computers. And we built them basically to code 2 to 5 million grants a year. And already this year with the new system, in the first 5 or 6 months of operation, we've coded over 1 million grants.
That's great.
And we've automated the coding of them as well, which is a very geeky process that I'd be glad to explain, but maybe I'll spare your listeners.
Well, it's a real challenge, I think, with so much data out there. It's so difficult for anybody to make head or tails of it. So the premium on the classification of data really has to be one of your major objectives.
I honestly think that open data in general is, on the balance, there's more good than bad to it. I think, it's easy for people to think of, the embarrassing things that might be extracted from a tax return. But, part of the theory of open data is that when it's open and more people are using it, there's lots of innovation. People create new products and services, new sources of knowledge. And the heavier use of that information improves the care and accuracy that people use in filling it out. So I think that's good. The complicated thing is that it makes it possible for people to reach rapid conclusions based on a little bit of data they really don't understand. As you said, you've toiled in this field for years to try to help the public understand philanthropy. But most people don't understand philanthropy. They don't understand foundations. So people will grab this data, they can make crazy conclusions. And I think this is going to place, as you said, a much higher premium on, to use jargon, sense-making, and people that really understand the field. The Foundation Center actually created, together with the Urban Institute and the Internal Revenue Service years ago, something called the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities. So when a nonprofit applies for charitable status, they're given an activity or a subject code by the IRS, and this is from this taxonomy. And we built on top of that a philanthropy classification system. So when we see a grant from a foundation on a tax return or directly transmitted to us by the foundation, we tag it, in today's parlance, for the subject of the grant, education, health, whatever. We tag it for the population group served, either the whole world or LGBTQ or women or men or low income or whatever. we tag it for the strategy used by the foundation. Is this grant for capacity building? Is it for capital support? Is it, whatever? We tag it for the type of organization, and then we geotag it for the geographic location of the benefit.
Well, when a treasure trove of information like this becomes available or potentially available, there's going to be a whole new set of actors who are going to be coming into the fray, whether they be startup or new businesses, and some of them we hope are well-intentioned, but some of them are not really going to be steeped in the history of philanthropy, and they're going to be sending out this information. So I know you're prepared for that. Yeah,
I think open data brings in a lot of people, and if you study the cycle of disruption, what usually happens is in any field, in publishing and online information, and in some ways organizations like the Foundation Center and GuideStar are nonprofit information businesses that are subject to the same kinds of disruptive cycles as the New York Times and LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters. So basically what happens is the data becomes open, or it becomes virtually open because it becomes so cheap. You get new entrants that require less infrastructure. They produce something which the incumbents feel isn't really very good and isn't up to quality, but some portion of the market decides, well, it's good enough.
Yeah.
And what happens, of course, is they get a little bit of income, and then most of them die off and go away or lose interest, but some of them get better.
Yep.
And if they get good enough, then they basically turn over industries. I was reading the other day about how Craigslist basically turned over the entire industry of print advertising. And Craigslist was, if you look at it, it's not very elegant. It's not very sophisticated, right?
It's like 1996.
Right. But anyway, it's just an example of what can happen. So, yeah, I think that there will be more people getting into this. And I think there'll be two types. There'll be these sort of, startups that just want to play with this data and see if, they can create something that the world will use or buy. But we're also seeing that there are large data analytics companies, with names like Palantir and RelSci, and these are very sophisticated companies. They use a lot of technology which actually comes from contracts they have with government, a lot of times around security issues or defense or whatnot. But like most enterprises in today's world, they also are looking to have a kind of CSR, corporate social responsibility.
Yep.
And they're looking to get into the philanthropic space by basically promising to use all their big data technology to be able to measure impact. I think the real obstacle for them is they're getting into it thinking that the space is occupied by lots of Gates foundations.
Yeah.
There's only one Gates Foundation.
Right.
And if you look at the 87,000 foundations in the U.S., as I said earlier,
7% have websites.
7% have websites, but only about 976 have assets of over 100 million, and 76% of them have 4 staff or less. So a foundation that has no staff or 2 staff are probably not going to be signing a contract with a sophisticated data analytics company.
Yeah, you're so right.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, sticking with data and classification, you have helped lead a cohort of like-minded colleagues around contributions that foundations are making to help the world achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as they're called. The target date is 2030. Refresh our listeners to exactly what the SDGs are, and then what have you created, what kind of platform to track the work of foundations towards helping make them happen?
Right. Well, in the year 2000, actually, the United Nations came up with something called the Millennium Development Goals. These are 15-year goals, basically, to try to inspire the world to basically improve health, education, and other kinds of social indicators for the poorest of the poor, especially in the developing world. Those expired at the end of 2015. A lot of progress was made, but there's still a lot to be done. And the UN embarked in a very long and sophisticated process, which all UN members participated in, all the national governments that are members of the UN, it's about 190 some odd countries. But also, over 8 million people participated directly online through the World We Want campaign. So this was sort of the largest participatory exercise that I know of in in human history, to try to come up with what the new 15-year global agenda should be. one thing that's really interesting is that they came up with an agenda that actually is for the whole world. The Millennium Development Goals were only for the so-called developing countries, the poor countries in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. This is for the whole world. So they're designed to address economic, environmental, and social disparities, not only between nations, but within nations.
Yep.
So what's really powerful about these is that they're as relevant in Detroit and Toledo as they are in Maputo and Jakarta.
Every country, every city has skin in the game.
Right. And a lot of people will look at the UN, sort of a jaundiced eye and say, oh my gosh, there's 17 goals. That's way too many. And there's 169 targets and there's 200 and something indicators. And one of the things I often say to people, I said, well, this was, 189, 190 nations agreed on this. Think of the organizations we work for foundations. Think if you put 190 foundations in a room. Do you think they could agree on 17 goals? I said, it's a pretty incredible achievement. And they're very ambitious,
Yep.
but they do, for the first time, cover the world, and they combine the Millennium Development Goals really didn't deal much with environment.
That's right.
This deals with water quality, with climate, and we feel that foundations have an important role to play in this. So the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, the United Nations Development Program, and the Foundation Center have something called the SDG Philanthropic Partnership, which is basically to help foundations understand this global framework, see how they're already participating in it and how they can actually increase their participation, and make it easier for them to forge the kind of partnerships with each other and with government and the private sector to spur the achievement of these goals and targets.
And you have a separate website around that, right?
Yeah, we have a website called sdgfunders.org. And we've actually, sort of done a back-of-the-envelope calculation based upon what we already know about what foundations are doing today and all the data we have in our databases about American philanthropy, but also a growing body of philanthropy in other countries, that we predict that very conservatively that foundations will spend over the next 15 years about $364 billion in grant money towards the realization of these objectives. And I think
which people estimate about $3.5 trillion is what's going to take. So it's a pretty sizable slice.
It's a sizable slice, and as we've been talking about, sort of laced through this. Again, this is the leverage that this money can produce is tremendous, precisely because of its low level of bureaucracy and its high degree of flexibility. There's just not a lot of flexibility in the world. I remember when I was, years and years ago, when I was with another foundation, a government-sponsored foundation, actually, we were starting to get invited to the World Bank for all these conversations about how to collaborate. And, we were all dreaming that the World Bank would take all of our cherished little projects and causes and put hundreds of millions of dollars into them. And after 2 years of conversations, basically, the World Bank staff turned around and asked us for grants. We learned a lot, because what we saw was that, they have hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's all tied up.
Yeah.
And it's all earmarked.
Nothing
and basically,
liquid.
$50,000 flexible money could basically unlock the potential of hundreds of millions.
Yeah. Let me move on to something else. We had Clara Miller, the president of the F.B. Herron Foundation, on the show earlier this year, and I think it's fair to say that they are the poster child for mission-related investing. And as you know, they have committed by the end of 2017, to have all of their assets deployed towards mission. That includes their endowment, which will all be invested in either nonprofit or for-profit companies, which are going to help them achieve their mission, which is helping people lift themselves out of poverty. Do you see this catching on with other foundations, or do you think it's going to be a long time coming?
If you'd asked me this 5 years ago, and you might have actually, I would have probably had a more skeptical answer than I have today. I'm sort of fascinated by the life cycle of ideas. And impact investing or mission investing, sometimes those are used interchangeably, was an idea, I think, that started out with a lot of hype.
Oh, sure did.
There were sort of evangelicals for it and zeal. The skeptics were saying that, that's all great, but, you can't get anywhere near market returns by these kinds of investments. There's not enough investment vehicles out there to absorb the amount of money that is in foundations and in the capital markets. Because remember, impact investors are also trying to influence the trillions of dollars that are in the capital markets.
That's
not
exactly
just
right. That's the whole name of the game.
The whole name of the game. But what's happened, of course, is, that there is a market, and because there's a market, instruments and investment vehicles begin to get created. So there's a lot more options for mission investing today, a lot more sophistication about it, and a lot more opportunities to do it. And what we're seeing is foundations are, in an earlier period, a number of foundations began to do, what was called negative screening. They basically were trying to make sure that there wasn't anything toxic or embarrassing in their investment portfolio, something that was totally contrary to their mission. Then they sort of thought about, well, are there can we put money in social investment funds, which are basically, mutual funds which promise not to do anything bad. But now there is a growing number of foundations that are saying, well, can we take all or part of our endowment and proactively make equity investments in nonprofit or for-profit enterprises that are actually furthering our mission.
Yeah.
So, for example, you're an environmental funder. You're using grants to fund really early-stage stuff for which there's no market solution. You're using something called program-related investments, which are essentially subsidized loans for charitable purposes that are permitted by the IRS to fund things for which there is something of a market but not a full-blown market. And then you're making straight-on equity investments in things like alternative energy.
Yeah.
And this is all related to your mission. So I think there's actually a lot of potential. We still see, we've done some survey on this, that 60% of the foundations we surveyed said they had not done mission investing and they had no plans to. So the orthodoxy is still something of it's like church and state. Basically you have an investment team that invests your resources, and their job is to maximize return with which you can fulfill your charitable purpose. And they're almost like, two separate entities residing within the foundation.
And what Heron did is they broke down those walls and made them all part of one team. And I think that cycle you talk about, I was looking it up recently, it's called the Gartner cycle. And it happens in so many different cases. I think it first happened with internet shopping, where everybody thought people would go to the internet.
Yeah.
They got hyped, and nobody would go to department stores. And of course, that's not what happened. But then we look now, 10, 15 years later, and that's exactly what happened. And I think it's also happened in online education. I remember Judith Rodin of Rockefeller was on the show, and when she was the president of the University of Pennsylvania, she said they were all terrified it was going to put them out of business. But after a couple of years, she realized that wasn't going to happen. But now you look and you say, my goodness, online education really is going to change the face of education in this country.
But I'll tell you, there's something I still worry about with impact investing. And actually, this sort of came back to me a bit when Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, announced their creation of their LLC, right? Yeah. And we got a lot of press calls on this. And the press calls are really interesting because the press was basically, the angle they were taking, well, isn't this just, they're just doing the LLC because it's a better tax deal. And none of them seem to be focusing on what actually I find potentially the most perplexing about or troublesome about LLCs and about impact investing. And this is the lack of transparency. Because the way an LLC works is it doesn't have the same disclosure requirements as a private foundation.
That's right.
So all you have to do on the tax return of an LLC is have a line which has a gross number for your charitable expenses and doesn't actually break them down by each individual grant you made. So what that means is that what we know about Mark Zuckerberg's philanthropy will be precisely what he chooses to tell us.
Very limited, yes.
And the thing with impact investing, too, because there are no disclosure requirements of impact investing. So there's no way, for example, for you to look at the tax return of a foundation and make a determination of which of those investments in their investment portfolio were impact or mission related and which were not.
Yeah.
And they don't have to tell you that.
That's right.
So I think the potential, for human nature is, of course, for sort of PR and hype around this and all these claims that ultimately are not verifiable because you don't have an independent data source are quite high. And the irony I find about this is that, when you look at the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Silicon Valley, breed of philanthropists, and you look at impact investors, these are people that basically, to do their job and make their fortunes, rely on incredible access to data and information. But they show relatively little concern about providing data and information about their own philanthropy to make the world a better place.
Yeah. I also find with impact investing, one of the paradoxes is that you're trying to get both a social return and a financial return. Well, if you're trying to get a social return, you would want to take whatever you're doing and make it open source and share it with everybody. But if you shared it with everybody, that would eat into your financial return. So almost embedded in it is a conflict which is very, very difficult to answer.
Yeah, when I first started working in this field, I actually started with the international division of the YMCA of the USA. And I remember the guy that was interviewing me, a very wise mentor, he said, well, the one thing I really have to understand about you is, are you comfortable living with ambiguity? And I think basically this whole field of philanthropy and social investment, it's fraught with ambiguity and contradictions. I think somebody once told me that, look, nobody really got to be a billionaire by being a nice guy. So the way that these fortunes have been accumulated, which have produced these great foundations, in some ways are a pretty sharp contrast to the wonderful things these foundations are doing in the world. And I think, there are these contradictions in impact investing, the highly competitive, secretive nature of the investment world does sort of go against this. And I think it's the same thing. I think it's really interesting about Silicon Valley. We all labor under the illusion that we have access to all this, wonderful free open information, through Apple and our Apple devices and Google and all these things. Google itself is not, is a remarkably untransparent corporation.
Yeah, well, you have to worry about stuff like that. I know that Facebook has just started this big effort with nonprofits to raise money on their Facebook pages, but you'll be doing all that fundraising on their platform, not your platform. And I don't think that a lot of nonprofits can turn their back on the opportunity, but that information is going to be controlled by Facebook, not by your organization, and they can change the rules anytime they want.
No, and what's really interesting is, we have a very good partner in China. Actually, I'm going there in a couple of weeks, and called the China Foundation Center. They're not formally connected to us, but we have a partnership relationship. And there's a raft of new charity laws in China, and one of them actually has language in it that would require nonprofits who are raising money online to only use government-approved online giving platforms. So, we like to think how different China is than the U.S., but basically, you basically got, you've got the Chinese government in China and you've got Facebook in the U.S.
There you go. That might be our lead. Well, let me ask you one last initiative at the Foundation Center, one that you just launched this summer. And it's a website dedicated to budding young philanthropists. Tell us about youthgiving.org.
Yeah, it was a great project, actually. It came to us from a wonderfully inspiring family foundation, the Frida C. Fox Family Foundation, and some other partners that are really actively trying to promote the involvement of young people, in some cases as young as 8 years, in becoming philanthropists. And a lot of this comes from family foundations that are dealing with successive generations of the family, and they're really wrestling with the problem, it's one thing for the founder and maybe the next generation to be dedicated to the foundation, but how do you keep the successive ones involved? And they said there is a movement, and we would like to basically explore this movement. We'd like to see how big it really is and create an information platform to connect all the different initiatives around the world on youth giving, and also to grow the amount of youth giving that's going on. So we developed this in tandem with a number of partners, youth giving foundations, sort of coalitions of youth giving or efforts. And we were quite surprised. We found a much wider universe of youth-giving programs that are really inspiring, really exciting, that you would expect from anything with the word youth in it, enormous amount of energy. And actually the initial name of the platform and the project was going to be Youth Philanthropy, but when we did the user groups in the design process, we found that very few young people relate to the word philanthropy.
Interesting.
They relate to the giving. That's what it's about,
Yeah.
you know. And so we changed it to youth giving. And
You listened.
We listened. We learned a lot. And I think that's part of the problem. I think with our field is we're very much wed to our terminology. And when you think about it, I mean, what philanthropy is about? It's about giving.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. Let me close on this, Brad. In this world of philanthropy of ours, is there anything that really concerns you that we're not paying enough attention to and you really wish more people were?
Yeah, to get back to a theme that's sort of been laced through our entire conversation, I do worry actually about the lack of transparency and the lack of transparency around new forms of philanthropy and impact investing, because I think the ability to turn that into great claims, hype, and self-promotion, especially in a world where self-promotion is the new modesty, is real. And I do think we do see too many examples, I think, of people who do not really want to be transparent about their philanthropic activities, that when they get in trouble in their business or their personal lives, they try to pull the rabbit out of the hat of the great grant they made for a cause.
Yeah.
But, that's a little bit too little too late. So that's one thing. The other thing I worry about is basically that if we look at philanthropy like an industry, and it is an industry.
It sure is. It's a business.
$800+ billion in assets is real money. Actually, if you look at Europe, there are over 140,000 of what they call public benefit foundations, who collectively, whose assets probably surpass those of the U.S. and whose charitable expenses are roughly the same. China, our partner there, has uncovered more than 3,000 of what are considered to be foundations in China. We have partners in Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, all over the world. This is a growing, hot industry. That's great, but it's a underperforming, inefficient industry. And I do think that it is incumbent upon the field to sort of get its act together on information, on sharing knowledge, reducing duplication, and basically looking before you leap.
Yeah.
When you're a new philanthropist, newly minted philanthropist, and you decide you're going to save the world through charter schools or virtually anything, it's a safe bet that you're not the first person to have ever done it. And I think, to make it much easier, when I think of lowering the transaction cost of finding out who else is funding what you're interested in and learning what they already know, that's something this field needs to do to really begin to punch above its weight.
Absolutely. So what do you got for us at foundationcenter.org and some of your other websites?
Lots of stuff, probably too much stuff, where we kind of have fertile minds and, active programmers and great staff. But one thing we have done recently, we have lots of websites and lots of, sub-websites. We've mentioned some of them today, sdgfunders.org, youthgiving.org, glasspockets.org. But if you just go to foundationcenter.org, we just redesigned and relaunched it, and what you'll see at the top of it looks very familiar. It's a search bar.
Yep.
And basically what we've allowed you to do is, through some very ingenious data science in the back end, we've allowed you to basically type anything in that search bar, and you're searching all the content of the Foundation Center. You're searching more than 5 million grants. You're searching more than 140,000 foundations. You're searching 20 years of digested news stories about philanthropy. You're searching a open archive of over 20,000 pieces of research funded or published by foundations. You're searching everything that's on all these websites we talked about. and you will get to see it all in ranked order. So if you want a quick fix,
Yeah, that will take you where you need to go.
they'll take you where you need to go, and then you can go right to the other sources.
Yeah, and the one that I go to every single day of my life is philanthropynewsdigest.org. I just love it. Aside from your website, Brad, I mean, do you have any physical locations here in New York City and around the country?
We sure do. You can come to our offices at 32 Old Slip, which is down here in the financial district of New York, Tuesday through Friday, 11 to 5. We have an open library. You can search our databases for free. You can look at books. Remember what those are. And we actually have staff there that can help you find basically how to fund your dream.
Great. Well, Brad Smith, the president and CEO of the Foundation Center, thanks so much for being on the program this evening. There's an awful lot going on in the world of philanthropy, and as always, the Foundation Center is in the center of it all. It was a real pleasure having you here.
Thank you very much.
The Business of Giving can be heard every Sunday evening between 6 and 7 p.m. Eastern on AM 970 The Answer in New York and on iHeartRadio. You can follow us at Biz of Give on Twitter and at Facebook.com/businessofgiving.